When people think about the Pokémon timeline, most imagine a simple line: Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and so on. In reality, the Pokémon games tell a much more complex story, full of time jumps, parallel worlds, and alternate dimensions. In this video, we will reconstruct the entire chronology of the mainline games, following the order of events in the Pokémon world, and will explore when and why the timeline splits into two. The origins. Long before Pokémon gyms, the Pokémon League, and even modern Pokéballs, there was an era that belongs to all Pokémon worlds, without exception. We are talking about Pokémon Legends Arceus. Set in Hisui, the ancient Sinnoh, during a time when humans and Pokémon had not yet learned to coexist peacefully. The protagonist, mysteriously arriving from the future by the will of Arceus, helps Team Galaxy study Pokémon and lays the foundations for modern society. When a space-time rift threatens Hisui, the protagonist intervenes to restore balance between time and space, stopping those who would try to shape the world to their own desires. This is the moment when the first Pokédexes and research efforts are born. And whether we talk about mega evolutions or other extraordinary powers, everything originates here. Based on the events recounted in this game, we can place the story approximately 100 to 150 years before the beginning of the timeline of the modern Pokémon games. This estimate comes from a conversation with Kamado, who claims to have lived during a period of great turmoil in the Johto region. This refers to a well-known historical event, the burning of the Brass Tower, which took place roughly 150 years before the events of Pokémon Gold and Silver. On that occasion, 3 Pokémon lost their lives and were later revived by Ho-Oh, reborn as Entei, Raikou, and Suqueen. Their resurrection caused fear among the people of Johto, who considered Ho-Oh and the revived Pokémon unnatural beings, prompting them to distance themselves. By connecting these events, it is plausible to assume that the story of the game takes place shortly after the fire, allowing us to estimate a time frame of 100 to 150 years before the current Pokémon timeline.
The modern era. In 1996, the first generation of Pokémon, thanks to Red, Blue, Green, and later Yellow, introduced the Pokémon world in its most classic form. In Kanto, we followed the journey of a young trainer starting from Pallet Town with the goal of becoming the champion of the Pokémon League, challenging 8 gyms and facing numerous rivals along the way. At the same time, the protagonist confronts Team Rocket, a criminal organization led by Giovanni, which exploits Pokémon for economic gain and power. The defeat of Team Rocket and victory at the League mark the end of this first major threat and the starting point for the modern Pokémon timeline. In 1999, Pokémon Gold and Silver were released in Japan. Set 3 years after the events in Kanto, these games show a world that has continued to evolve. The protagonist explores Johto, a region deeply connected to traditions and legendary Pokémon, while confronting the remnants of Team Rocket, now in decline. Along the journey, ancient legends emerge surrounding Ho-Oh, Lugia, and the 3 legendary Pokémon, Entei, Raikou, and Suqueen, symbols of a past marked by tragedy and rebirth. The journey also includes exploration of Kanto and symbolically concludes with an encounter with Red, representing the previous generation and the passing of the torch. In this case, the temporal connection is direct and explicitly stated, emphasized multiple times throughout the game. Furthermore, thanks to the remakes Pokémon Heart Gold and Silver Sue, we gain additional narrative depth that makes the time skip even more concrete. This refers specifically to the special Celebi event, which allows the player to witness key moments from Giovanni's past. Through this event, we learn about the relationship between Giovanni and his son, none other than our rival, and witness Giovanni's attempted return during the assault on the Goldenrod radio tower. Thanks to Celebi's powers, the protagonist becomes directly involved in these past events, managing both to thwart the attack on the radio tower and to definitively stop Giovanni. Next, we come to Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, released in 2002. the third generation shifts the focus to the balance between nature and civilization. In Hoenn, the protagonist becomes involved in the schemes of Team Magma or Team Aqua, who seek to harness the power of legendary Pokémon to reshape the world according to their own vision. These attempts unleash primordial forces embodied by Groudon and Kyogre, threatening the entire regional ecosystem. Only through the intervention of Rayquaza and the actions of the protagonist is natural balance restored. In this case, there is no explicit connection that allows us to determine exactly how much time has passed between the second and third generations. The temporal placement is therefore purely estimated, based solely on observations of the game's environment and the level of technology shown. It is possible to hypothesize a gap of about 2 to 3 years, mainly due to the introduction of a more advanced communication system compared to the Pokégear from Gold and Silver, the PokéNav. This device includes additional functionalities, such as a radar and more advanced monitoring systems, as well as virtue controls, introduced starting in the third generation. As we will see later, thanks to the remakes of these games, it becomes clear that from the sixth generation onward, the narrative shifts to a different dimension, which I would define as the dimension of energy. We then move to 2006 with the release of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. In Sinnoh, the Pokémon narrative reaches a cosmic scale. Team Galactic attempts to control time and space by summoning Dialga and Palkia, aiming to create a new universe devoid of emotions. The protagonist opposes this plan, confronting the deities of time and space and restoring balance to the Pokémon universe. Sinnoh definitively consolidates the mythology of the series, introducing Arceus as the creator of the Pokémon world and linking past, present, and future in a single grand narrative. As already observed in the transition between the second and third generations, there is no explicit connection that allows us to precisely define the time elapsed. Consequently, the most coherent approach is to adopt an estimate similar to that used previously, based on the technological evolution shown in the game. In particular, the time gap can be estimated at between 3 and 5 years, considering both the development of the main communication device, in this case the Pokétech, and the significant technological advancement of the antagonistic team. Team Galactic is far more advanced than the criminal organizations of previous generations, suggesting a Pokémon world that has made another step forward in terms of scientific and infrastructural progress. We have now entered the peak gaming era of the franchise, a period in which many of the best Pokémon games were released. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl in 2006, Pokémon Platinum in 2008, Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver in 2009, and the 5th generation games, Pokémon Black and White and Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, released in 2010 and 2012 respectively. The latter introduces a more mature and reflective story. In Unova, the protagonist confronts Team Plasma, an organization advocating for the liberation of Pokémon from trainers, challenging the very relationship between humans and Pokémon. At the center of the conflict is Hoenn, a charismatic and idealistic figure capable of communicating with Pokémon, convinced that separation is the only viable path. The journey culminates in a clash of opposing ideals, represented by the legendary Pokémon Reshiram and Zekrom, leaving a profound moral reflection on the Pokémon world. 2 years after these events, the story continues, showing a transformed and more developed Unova. Team Plasma returns in a more radical and violent form, revealing the true intentions of its leader, Getsis. The protagonist faces a new crisis, defending the region from a global conquest plan and ultimately restoring peace. Unlike previous cases, in this instance it is possible to determine precisely how much time has passed between the 4th and 5th generations. The events of Pokémon Black and White occur 5 years after those in Sinnoh.
This information is derived from indirect references in the games, such as certain dialogues in Castelia City, but is also confirmed by official sources, including the strategy guide and interviews with Shigeki Morimoto, a Game Freak programmer, which explicitly attest to this time skip. With Black 2 and White 2, the story of this timeline concludes, covering a total span of approximately 15 to 18 years since Pokémon Red and Blue, encompassing all events from the 4th to the 5th generation. The Dimension of Energy. It is 2013, and for the first time in the history of the franchise, the pair of games from the outgoing generation were released simultaneously worldwide. The world thus welcomed Pokémon X and Y. The 6th generation marks a turning point for the entire saga. Indeed, we witness the transition to a 3D graphics engine, which, in my humble opinion, represents a point of no return for the Pokémon games. Visually, I consider these games among the most beautiful in terms of environments and first visual impact. In Kalos, Mega Evolution is introduced, the first true game mechanic derived directly from the lore, consisting of a temporary transformation made possible by an ancient energy born during a war in the distant past. In these games, the protagonist opposes Team Flare and its leader, Lysander, who wishes to use the power of an ultimate weapon to create a more beautiful world capable of preserving beauty, even at the cost of destruction. In the game's final dialogues, we are shown a flashback recounting the troubled history of AZ, marked by war, violence, and a long quest for redemption. The conflict shown in these memories dates back approximately 3,000 years, and it is this event that marks the split between the two major narrative dimensions of the Pokémon world. On one side, we have the timeline from Pokémon Red and Blue up to Black and White 2. On the other, a new dimension begins with Pokémon X and Y. The separation between these two worlds is caused by AZ's use of the ultimate weapon, whose function generates a new form of energy, Mega Energy. Although this pivotal moment is recounted directly in X and Y, to fully understand the birth of this alternative dimension, we must take a step back. The first game that can be placed in this new timeline is Pokémon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which presents an alternate version of the events in Hoenn. In ORAS, the protagonist embarks on the classic journey to become champion of the region, but soon becomes involved in a crisis of global scale. Team Magma or Team Aqua attempts to awaken Groudon or Kyogre in their primal forms, fueled by an uncontrolled amount of energy. This imbalance threatens the stability of the entire planet, forcing the protagonist to intervene. Unlike the original titles, the conflict is no longer limited to Hoenn alone, but assumes a worldwide dimension. It is in this context that a variant of Mega Energy is introduced, natural bioenergy emanating from the Earth, discovered by the grandfather of Joseph Stone, father of Stephen Stone, Hoenn's champion. This energy allows Mega Evolution to occur even far from Kalos and greatly amplifies the power of the primordial Pokémon, turning the crisis into an unprecedented event. Another key element of this narrative dimension is the role of the Devon Corporation, which actively studies this form of energy, known now as Devon Energy. This energy is very similar to Mega Energy, but has a different origin. Devon Energy derives from natural bioenergy emitted by the Earth, released following the collision of a meteorite with Hoenn, an event that would later lead to the creation of Sootopolis City. In contrast, Mega Energy does not exploit the planet's natural energy, but instead is based on the vital energy of the Pokémon themselves. This aspect is explicitly stated by Professor Cosmo during the Delta episode and is confirmed multiple times throughout the adventure of Pokémon Legends ZA.
That said, even in this case, it is not possible to determine with certainty the exact time gap between the events of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire and those of Pokémon X and Y. As with other points in the timeline, we must rely on deductive reasoning based on narrative and contextual elements provided by the games. In ORAS, Mega Evolution still appears as a relatively recent phenomenon. It is actively studied, particularly by the Devon Corporation, and is presented as a potentially unstable force capable of generating excess energy that could threaten the entire planet. Key characters such as Steven and Professor Sycamore are not yet involved in global research, and the use of Mega Evolution seems largely limited to Hoenn and Kalos. All of these elements suggest that this is an early phase of experimentation in which Mega Energy is not yet fully understood or widespread. The situation is radically different in Pokémon X and Y. Here, Mega Evolution is widely known, taught to those deemed suitable, and fully integrated into official battles. Standardized Mega Rings exist, energy theory is well established, and research has moved beyond the experimental phase, implying years of study, dissemination, and regulation. A transition of this kind could hardly occur in just 1 or 2 years. Comparing this shift to the confirmed time jumps in the series makes the picture even clearer. Between the first and second generation, 3 years pass, accompanied by relatively minor changes. Between the fourth and fifth generation, the gap is 5 years, bringing with it much deeper technological and social transformations. The shift from ORAS to XY shows changes more significant than those between the first and second generation, and comparable, if not greater, in scope to those between the fourth and fifth generation. For this reason, an estimate of less than 5 years would be inconsistent with the story and evolutionary logic of the Pokémon world. We now arrive at 2016 with Pokémon Sun and Moon, and 2017 with their enhanced versions, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Set in the tropical region of Alola, these games focus heavily on characters and personal stories. The protagonist faces Team Skull, but more importantly, a deeper threat connected to the Ultra Beasts in alternate dimensions. The story revolves around Lily's family, highlighting the darker side of scientific research and making explicit the concept of a Pokémon multiverse. With Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, we see a variation of the same events, introducing the Ultra World and a different threat led by Necrozma. The story further reinforces the idea of alternative timelines, where the same events can unfold in different ways. As with nearly every generational time jump, the temporal estimate here is not officially confirmed, but is derived deductively. However, compared to other points in the timeline, it is possible to make a more reliable estimate thanks to the presence of specific characters who act as temporal indicators. The first key elements are Sina and Dexio, assistants of Professor Sycamore, who appear in Sun and Moon and their Ultra versions in a form only slightly older than in Pokémon X and Y. This minimal difference suggests a short time interval, unlikely to exceed 2 years. Looking at characters connected to Kanto provides additional confirmation. In the post-game of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, it is possible to encounter Red and Blue Oak, presented in a visibly older version, presumably about 10 years older. A legitimate question arises. If Red and Blue belong to another narrative dimension, how can they serve as a temporal reference? The answer is twofold. First, there is no evidence that the events of the original dimension did not also occur in this new timeline. Second, and more convincingly, Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee comes into play. These titles tell an alternate version of the Kanto events where Red and Blue are not the ones stopping Team Rocket, but new protagonists. However, Red and Blue still exist in this timeline and are presented as true legends of the region, reinforcing the idea that their deeds belong to a recent past. It is in Let's Go that we find another crucial character to establish the time gap between XY and Sun and Moon, Mina. In Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, she serves as a captain, while in Let's Go, she appears as a much younger child, with an estimated age difference of about 10 years or more. From this, we can summarize the timeline. Assuming that over 10 years pass between the Kanto version shown in Let's Go, representing the starting point for this timeline, and assuming that the time between events in the different regions mirrors that of the original timeline, we can construct a coherent sequence. Approximately 5 years between Kanto and Hoenn, at least 5 more between Hoenn and Kalos. Consequently, we can conclude that the time elapsed between Pokémon XY and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon is relatively short, ranging from a few months to a maximum of about 2 years. We have now entered the Switch era, more precisely 2019, when the world welcomed Pokémon Sword and Shield. In Galar, the Pokémon world appears more structured and spectacular than ever. Gym challenges are now mass sporting events, while the protagonist becomes involved in an energy crisis tied to the region's past. Chairman Rose's plan to secure Galar's future at any cost awakens ancient forces and gives rise to the Dynamax phenomenon. The story portrays a Pokémon world that is modern, technological, and interconnected. A few years later, in 2022, Pokémon Scarlet and Violet are released. The 9th generation represents the most advanced point in Pokémon history. In Paldea, the protagonist explores an open region and faces mysteries linked to Area Zero and Paradox Pokémon. The plot introduces themes related to time manipulation and artificial intelligence, pushing the Pokémon world into an almost sci-fi dimension. It is the culmination of decades of narrative and technological evolution. Finally, at the end of 2025, Game Freak releases its latest creation, Pokémon Legends ZA. Set in Kalos, in Lumiose City, it takes place approximately 5 years after the events of Pokémon X and Y. The game tells the story of a period of profound change in the region, focused on an ambitious urban renewal project aimed at creating a city where humans and Pokémon can coexist more harmoniously. The protagonist becomes involved in this process, but tensions arise regarding the use of mega energy, which is now widespread but not entirely without consequences. The game explores the social, environmental, and political impact of this energy, showing how its use has shaped Kalos in the years following XY. Throughout the adventure, the historical roots of Mega Evolution, its connection to the 3,000-year-old war, and AZ's legacy are explored, highlighting how past decisions continue to influence the present. The reason I decided to discuss these 3 games together is simple. At this point in the chronology, we enter a shared time period where all titles in this narrative dimension begin to overlap and interact. There are no longer sharp jumps or obvious separations, but rather a network of clues that must be pieced together to build a coherent timeline. We can therefore only place the temporal elements provided and create a plausible reconstruction. Here's my interpretation. The events of Pokémon Sword and Shield occur before those of Legends Pokémon ZA. This can be deduced from dialogues at Hotel Richissime, where Jacinthe mentions that prior to meeting the ZA protagonist, she had received a visit from a former undefeated champion from Galar, clearly referring to Leon, defeated by the Sword and Shield protagonist after the climax of the Eternatus battle. Considering the events of the 8th generation games, we know that once defeated, Leon takes over the company of former Chairman Rose, initiating major structural and image changes. A transformation of this kind is unlikely to be immediate. It is reasonable to assume it takes several months, up to about a year. Only after this period would Leon be able to leave the region for an official visit abroad. Additionally, at least a few weeks or months likely pass between his meeting with Jacinthe and the start of ZA's events. Now let's consider Paldea, which is arguably the most complex connection. A key point, Pokémon Scarlet and Violet narrate events that clearly occur after Sword and Shield. This is evidenced by a book in the Academy Library, Galar, A History, written by Sonia, recounting Galar's events from her perspective. 2 important observations arise. The mere fact that Galar's events are presented historically implies for obvious reasons that Paldea's events occur afterward. Sonia is explicitly referred to as Professor of the Galar region, further reinforcing the idea that several years have passed since the conclusion of Sword and Shield. For these reasons, we can place the events in Paldea shortly after or potentially contemporaneous with the events of Legends Pokémon ZA. There are no direct dialogues or references to Paldea in other games, but it's also true that what happens in Scarlet and Violet would hardly become public knowledge as it involves no regional or global catastrophe. The only possible external reference could have been the book written by Heath's ancestor Briar, but no trace of this text exists outside Paldea, making it impossible to use as a temporal anchor. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. We've taken a journey through the Pokémon game timeline, trying to put all generations in order, from Red and Blue through Gold and Silver, all the way to Legends Pokémon ZA and Scarlet and Violet. We've seen how, thanks to small details in dialogues, in-game books, and recurring characters, it is possible to estimate time jumps between games and reconstruct a coherent timeline, even if not always precise to the exact year. If you agree or have different perspectives, leave a comment below. I love reading your opinions and discussing differing ideas. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and if you want to continue exploring the Pokémon world from a deeper perspective, subscribe to the channel to not miss future content. See you next time!